Hello, this is Colin, and on today's tea, we're going to be talking about coffee. Well, coffee houses in particular, which actually do have an important part to play in the history of tea. So, coffee houses first appeared in major urban centers in the Islamic Middle East. These were, of course, very much frowned upon by the authorities, particularly the imams would complain about the fact that there were these men who would get together and they would drink coffee and listen to poetry and play board games and talk politics, and so these things were frowned upon, of course. Now, the story goes that after the last Turkish siege of Vienna, the retreating Turkish army left behind sacks of these beans that nobody knew what they were for until they figured out what it was. It was coffee. So Europe began to get an interest in coffee. The first coffee was actually imported via Venice, which had trade links with the Ottoman Empire. And the first coffee shop was in England, was opened up in 1652 by a Jewish merchant named Jacob the Angel. Apparently, there's still a coffee shop on that spot to this day. Actually, a lot of the people who imported coffee at the time were Jews or Armenians or people that had links with the Middle East, sort of making the transition. Anyway, coffee shops became quite popular. So by about 1675, it had spread to Paris, and there was about 3,000 coffee shops across England, something like 500 of them in London alone. And of course, the coffee shop you went to said a lot about who you were. They sort of specialized in their clientele. You had coffee shops for merchants and doctors and clergymen and intellectuals and authors and publishers. All had their own favorite haunts. So once again, the authorities became quite alarmed because it would be these men. And in Britain, in England and France, it was exclusively men. Women were allowed to go to coffee shops in Germany, but not in Britain and France. And they would get together and they would while away the afternoon and they would have the newspapers and they would talk politics. And the coffee shop soon got this reputation of social equality. Like any man of any social level could actually go to the coffee shop, debate politics, read the newspapers, get the latest news, and basically do things to alarm the government. Charles II actually tried to have coffee shops shut down because they were considered so subversive and hotbeds of republicanism. Shudder to think. So, anyway, now the first place many people would have actually had tea was in coffee shops, because coffee shops didn't only sell coffee. They sold sometimes alcohol. They sold ale, beer, but they sold coffee and sherbet and tea and chocolate. And it must not have been a very pleasant experience because these were they're very male. The room would have been full of tobacco smoke, and the drinks would have been boiling all day because the taxman would come in the morning to see how much you had brewed up. So you brew up these huge barrels of tea and coffee, and he would write that down and tax you on it, and you weren't allowed to make any more. So there's no such thing as this 20-minute fresh cup of coffee. You had to make your drinks and serve it all day and keeping it warm on a fire. So it was very communal. There were benches, and like I say, there were people who would go there to discuss business, to discuss science, to discuss the events of the day, to discuss politics. And it was, like I said, it was probably the only place outside of a rich person's house that you could find tea. I was reading there was one estate that spent $600 on its staff. 600 pounds on the staff for a year, which includes, of course, coachmen, gardeners, butlers, cooks, what have you. A lawyer for a year would cost you £20. A common laborer, a footman, would be like £6. Tea costs £26 for a pound. £26. So more than the cost of a lawyer and a footman. Well, the cost of a lawyer and a footman combined for a year would buy you a pound of tea. So while tea was more readily available in coffee houses, it still was not particularly cheap. So one other thing these places did is that they sold tea in bulk, which allowed people to take the tea home to give to their wives and thus establish tea culture in people's homes. And as the price of tea eventually did drop, the more widespread came the convention of serving tea at home. Although, even now, an English friend of mine says that there's a saying in England that drink tea at home and coffee when you roam. So there you are. Today's tea is black grapefruit, and I'll see you another time. Cheers.